Hey ho, young explorers, James Raffin here with another video to provide context and background to help start the process. Maybe you're already a little ways along of learning knots, ties, and splices of traditional sailors. Now, making a Turk's head knot like that is not all that complicated, but it does take your full attention, and it will, I promise, provide a window into the wonderful world of knots that every true explorer needs to know. Now, perhaps like you, if you've been a Girl Guide or a Cub or a Brownie or a Scout, I first came to know a little bit about knots through Boy Scouts, and it was at first kind of an academic exercise. You learned the name, the reef knot, you learned how to tie it, you learned some uses of it, and that was about it. But it was fun. You had the tactile experience of the touching experience of actually tying the knots, and some of them were pretty, some of them were pretty ugly. But as soon as I started venturing out by canoe, by snowshoe, dog sled, bicycle, many other conveyances, camping out for weeks and sometimes months on end, tying knots was anything but academic. It was an essential part of safe practice. For an adventure, if you were hanging over a waterfall to get a picture, or to scout a rapid, or if you were attaching loads to a plane or a snow machine, or maybe even just fixing up a clothesline to dry your wet clothes. Knots matter, that's for sure. And if there's one thing that separates real explorers from wannabes or posers, in my estimation, it's the ability to tie strong, appropriate, and often simple knots that totally fit the need for an occasion. So there's a functional aspect to knots, making sure that things stay attached to each other or to stay where you left them. But as you'll realize in this making activity, there's an aesthetic, there's beauty involved in knots and knot tying as well. A Turk's head knot is a functional knot, that's for sure, but it's also part of a family of decorative knots that were tied by sailors to spiff up their spars, their masts, their stanchions, or steering wheels. And in this case, I've chosen the Turk's head knot because it makes a cool bracelet, but also having a bracelet on your arm that you know how to tie ensures that you always have some cord in the event that you need to pull a load together or tie something down during your travels. Now, our resource person for this activity is one of a very rare breed of experts, perhaps one of just a very few in the whole world, who know and ropes and splices and ties so well that he is in demand worldwide to help in solving crimes where knots, ties, splices, cords, ligatures, even big hawsers, big ropes from ships are used in the commission of a crime. My friend Rob Chisno is such a person. He's a forensic knotting expert, but beyond putting on his suit and tie to testify in courtrooms, Rob is also loves the art, science, magic, and mathematics of knots. This being the COVID time, as with all our other videos, I caught up with Rob by Zoom from his home in Kingston, Ontario, and I should tell you that Rob's knowledge of all things knots goes far beyond the simple understandings of people like you and me. So if you get a little bit lost or disoriented when he's going forward, then second of all, you can always come back to this video once you've had some experience with your own Turk's head bracelet. So here's my conversation with Rob now. Good morning, Rob Chisno.
Well, good morning.
It's not every day I get to talk to a friend, but also a friend who's a recreational mathematician. I love you're the only recreational mathematician I know, but also a man with a passion for ropes and lines and ligatures and knots and all that sort of thing. And I'm delighted to have you in here as part of the Science Rendezvous Exploration Central.
So I'll sort of hop around between sort of the practical and the theoretical. We can start right from the very basic. Okay, so that's a simple trefoil knot, which is the basis of the overhand knot. It has 3 crossings, and that's probably the simplest Turk's head you can tie, okay? it's a representation of a topological knot. So to a mathematician, a knot has no ends, so it can't be untied. And of course, when you make a nice aesthetic Turk's head, you hide the ends. You can sew them, melt them, or tuck them in or whatever, okay?
Right.
So the last characteristic is how many times you repeat the pattern. So this is one ply or one lay. I've gone once around, okay?
Right.
Yeah. So that's sort of a basic idea there. Now, so I'll show you something a little bit bigger. Again, I've used a retired piece of climbing rope, okay? And again, I flattened it out. So the axis is here. So if you look at it, 1, 2, 3 leads going around the axis. 1, 2, 3, 4 bites. So it's 4 bites. And again, it's single ply, single lay kind of thing, okay? Now, the one that you tied, I just looked at it quickly. It looked like a 7 bite, 1, 2, 3. So it's 3 lay. It looks like a 7 bite kind of thing. And you've got 3 ply, it looks like.
So where would this knot first have been tied or described? Or maybe those are two different things.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's probably, from seamanship, sailing. And if you look at like most of our modern knotting comes from seamanship and sailing. And you think of, the weeks and weeks, men had on board, and they had to neaten up the ends of lines and halyards and so forth. And they would sort of, if you play around with the rope enough, you'll eventually invent these things. Somebody will say, "Oh, I'll tuck it in here, make it look a little nicer." So they'll put those on the wheel of the ship or whatever. It's very similar to coxcombing, all kinds of things. There's actually in Ashley's book, he's got several types of multi-end Turk's heads that join ends and make a very fancy knob knot kind of thing. It's kind of a stopper. To a true purist, Turk's head has one piece of cord, 2 ends, and that's it. And you keep going around. But there are other versions that have multiple strands and stuff. So the other thing is our classic Turk's heads look like that. And some people have taken to calling them cylindrical or tubular. So that one's tucked in there. That one happens to be, okay, you can read my label there, 3 lead, okay?
Yeah, 4 bites and 3
ply, 3 ply or 3 lay, okay? There we go. Okay, so I've got other examples here. So that's our standard version there, but then you can flatten them out and make mats with the simple ones, okay? So there it is. So our axis would be right here, and we just flatten it out. So you can make a doily or a mat or whatever like that. So if you look at this, it's got 5 bites. So the number inside should correspond to the number outside as well. And it's 3 across, and then it's 3 ply, okay?
Have essentially what you've done, I could flatten this out?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And then you'd tighten it up a bit, decrease the size of the middle, and increase the outside, and flatten it right out.
Yeah. Okay.
Just like
Same
that.
knot.
Yeah. So the other thing you can do, you can tighten it right up into a sphere, and it becomes a button knot. Okay.
Right.
And usually the smaller ones work better. The bigger ones, they get really deformed. You need something inside, kind of like a monkey's fist, something inside to tie it around, okay? And I think the one that you tied, this is it flattened out. You can see that, that's 7 right there. That looks like the one you did. So I've tightened it up. It's sort of the fate of retired climbing ropes. There we go. But you see, as it gets,
I've ever seen a rope that color.
Yeah, this is old stuff from the gym. I inherit all the ropes from the gym and just make stuff of it. But the more bites you get, you increase the texture, the hole gets bigger kind of in the middle. So I got some other things to show you. So you get more elaborate. I'll get further back here. You can see that, okay? But this isn't a true Turk's head, okay? Because the outside is 14 bites. The inside, the hole in the middle, is 7, okay? And it's 6 across. So if I actually deformed this, this would look more like a cone or a dome. It's smaller here than here, okay? If I went 14 and 14, the hole would be huge in the middle. Some people will call this a Turk's head, some won't. It's actually 2 different strands of rope. They go in different directions, okay? So it breaks the rule of having 1 rope, 2 ends. It's got 2 ropes, 4 ends kind of thing, and they interweave, okay?
Geez, you could have a stall at the market, Rob.
Yeah. Well, I got tons and tons here. It's like we have all our retired ropes wind up being mats, and yeah. So just a review here. So I talked about leads, bites, ply, and then the number of strands, which doesn't make it a true Turk's head. And these will determine your texture, your width, your circumference of the Turk's head, your basic size, the things you want to play around with. Okay, so these are sort of the instructions I used up at camp for the seven bite, the one that you tied, and I have different ways of showing that. I gather that's probably the one you want to teach to the kids or try to teach. Is that correct?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
And I use my hand as
Yeah.
The axis of.
Okay. Let's go here. Some of the math involved here. Okay.
Walk me through the math there a little bit.
Okay, I've left a little bit out here. Okay, but what they're doing is they have a reference point, and I'd have to get all the definitions for this. Part of this is the number of times it crosses over, how many times it goes around, and they have different definitions for these symbols right here.
Why would you want to, or what is the purpose of describing knots mathematically? Like what
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of applications. One is they're getting into how DNA forms its quaternary structure, how is it unwraps and wraps kind of thing. And DNA will actually tie knots kind of thing. And they do that to analyze various viruses and stuff like that. They're also using the mathematics to look at what are called anions, or errors in quantum computers, and it corrects the errors. And they do it because it's tangled kind of thing. And again, the math, this is just a sample of the math here, okay? So here's your classic flat mat. You can get all kinds of designs, but depending on where you join, if you join this edge with this edge, you get a certain types of Turk's head. If you join this edge with this edge, you get another Turk head, okay? And here's their description, depending on which way you go. And basically a Turk's head is, a regular alternating knot. Okay, so you don't get a cross that goes over two at a time. It goes over, under, over, under. So that's just a sample of some of the math involved. Okay.
Can you say a word or two about what you do as a kind of professional knot guy?
Yeah, so my background basically as a climber, and for years and years I taught rock climbing, also safety, rescue, things like that, and of course practical application of knots. But then I also got called in to look at court cases. So two types of cases: civil cases and criminal cases. So the civil cases, obviously looking at accidents involving disconnection of improperly tied knots and other climbing errors, but also looking at criminal cases involving autoerotic fatalities, homicide, suicide, where victims have been tied up by perpetrators. So looking at, most of the time, basic knots, overhand knots, half hitches, things like that, trying to find out the order of tying, whether a person was self-tied or somebody else tied them, possibly two tires, possible handedness of the tire, characteristics like that. The big test in a lot of areas in the world is the Dover test. Like, they have various questions they ask you. Is there a scientific basis for your opinion? Have you published any research articles, things like that? So that gives me advantage in court, because a lot of people profess to be forensic knot experts, and they're not really, kind of thing, So I've looked at a lot of, I try to grab anything off the, scientific literature that's applicable. I've been looking at medical knot tying. I've been looking at psychology, epistemology, topology, engineering, all those things. Things I've been working on is security of knots. Like, most recently, there was a research paper that came out last year from MIT, and they were looking at a mathematical way of predicting the security and strength of knots. So they're looking at what's called topological circulation energy and topological twist energy kind of thing. So looking at how things cross that. And practical knots, it sort of bridges the gap between lore and tradition and science and mathematics kind of thing. So I've sort of got my feet in both realms kind of thing.
Do you see yourself as a kind of a knot explorer? Does that even ring true in your head, or how do you position yourself relative to this body of knowledge and ways of knowing?
I guess I explore in a sense. One of the papers I wrote recently, actually a few years ago, for was it the Journal of Forensic Identification, trying to classify a level of skill of tires kind of thing. So, and it's like a 6-level thing. Very basic would be an innate tire, just sort of ties randomly. A practical tire goes all the way up. And then you might have a trained, experienced tire. So I'd say somebody who invents knots, plays around with knots, develops new ideas, be an innovative tire. So I might be at that end of the scale. So, there's a few knots I've, invented. They may be published, they may be not. They may have been co-invented by somebody on the other side of the world. They're just not mainstream at all. So it's a matter of getting it out there.
If one of the people who is making a Turk's head and gets quite excited about knot tying, what would some next steps be that you would recommend for them to keep scratching that itch? Is there a book, or with the same piece of cord, other things they might do with it?
Okay, yeah, there's 2 ways they can go. It depends on whether they want to learn practical knot tying or decorative knot tying. And a good thing to do right off the bat is get online and look up the International Guild of Knot Tyers, see what they have to offer. There's a Canadian, North American branch. It's based in Great Britain. They can join. I think I have like a lifetime membership now. They grandfathered me. It's a polite way of saying I'm old. But I think it's like £10, something like that a year or something like that. But you get Knotting Matters, which is a little magazine, and there's all kinds of, there's discussion groups online. I never get online. There's all these blogs and stuff like that. And a lot of times they're repeating things that have been done before, but there's some very interesting discussions and information in Knotting Matters. If they want the Bible, everybody keeps following the Ashley Book of Knots, of course. Okay. If people want to get into sort of other things, there's also the History and Science of Knots. This got some stuff also about indigenous knot tying. It's got the history of knot tying. Hominids have been tying knots for thousands and thousands of years. There's all kinds of stuff, mathematics, everything in there. If they really want to go hog wild and learn about the math, they can get into stuff like this. This is from Waikato University, and this has got all kinds of sophisticated math and stuff about how to do braids and so forth. So you can do, fancy work. There's also macrame groups, knitting groups. Of course, knitting is all knots and stuff like that. There are lots of very simple books you can get, but that's a good one there. You look for something with really good illustrations, and it gives you a basic background of, fishing knots, camping knots, climbing knots. This is a good one here too. This was available for a while from the Mountain Equipment Co-op. Okay, it's a translated one. There's an old book that Jeffrey Budworth wrote, the knot book there. It's got some of my knots in it. So it depends on how hog wild people want to go. For starting off, like if you pick up the Ashley Book of Knots, you'll be overwhelmed. There's thousands in there, so, and you're like, oh yeah, I don't need to look at this. But somebody says, I'm interested in fishing knots, or I'm interested in macrame. And there's books specifically on that. There's even books on string games. You could zero in on one area.
Just to wind up, Rob, what are you working on right now? What's keeping you going with knots and ties and stuff right now?
Let me see. There's a bunch of forensic cases on hold, kind of thing, because obviously we can't travel much. Also, more recently, a ropes course accident, which I can't talk about. I've got some research going on, so I'm preparing a paper right now for the journal. It's called Spatial Cognition and Computation. So I'm looking at 16 basic components or fact knots. I'm looking at all combinations and permutations, then looking at a visual random walk analysis, and then trying to code that kind of thing and link it to the literature and link it to things like handedness, teaching, comprehension, and so forth.
Well, if I go down and kill the local grocer and tie him up, and you get called, would you be able to get to me based on my bad knot tying, or is there more?
Yeah, it's one thing. Yeah, that's interesting because a lot of people don't understand what exactly forensic knot analysis is. So there's 2 basic types of evidence. There's individual evidence and there's group or characteristic evidence. So individual evidence would be, it'd be specific, like a fingerprint, DNA, things like that, very specific to one person. Then there's group specific or class specific. So that's knot tying. So there'd be like blood typing. So you might say, for example, be a person who ties SZ reef knots out of habit kind of thing. Well, you belong to the group in the population that ties that. So it narrows the group of likely suspects, but it doesn't zero in on one person kind of thing. Yeah, so that's the basic
But
idea.
you could actually go beyond that with specialized knots that somebody wouldn't get to by accident, or that they would need to have specialized knowledge.
That's right. Yeah, if you encountered, for example, a Prusik knot, or more sophisticated version of the figure 8 knot, and say, oh, this person possibly has rescue training or caving training or something like that. I had one case years ago where there were two structures. A person was tied up and they were robbed, and the knot looked very much like a Prusik knot. And there's a certain way to tie the Prusik knot, but it was tied in a different way. It was tied in the way a macrame tire would tie it, using the end rather than on the bite. So the method of tying as well as the structure is an indicator. So, oh yeah, this person probably knows something about working with fancy knots or macrame or something like that.
And did that help convict somebody?
I'm not sure. Like, a lot of times they don't get back to me. I'll read about it, and most of the time I submit a report. It helps them. So I'll do, I'd say out of about 1 of every 10 or 20 cases, I wind up in court. So it's very rare, thank goodness, kind of thing. But when you're going to court, it's pretty serious. The evidence is important to the case, kind of thing.
It's nice to see you. We've known each other a long time, my friend.
Yeah, like 70s. Who said that?
yeah, that's 50 years ago.
Yeah. I just this is my 60th year climbing.
Wow,
60.
you're older than dirt.
Gee, thanks.
Excellent. Well, good to see you. Many thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Okay, take care.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.